Salesforce crash course with Saban. In this video, we're going to be going over a really cool topic, which are Apex triggers. Triggers are really cool because they allow us a systematic way to be able to handle whenever data changes in Salesforce and be able to take action upon that data change in a way that some of these out-of-the-box tools simply don't allow us to do. Hopefully by this point in the course, you've been able to explore, study, and implement your own versions of things like process builders, workflow rules, flows, and a lot of other out-of-the-box features, including validation rules, forgot that one. And you've explored some of the considerations about them and some of the limitations, the pros and the cons. Sometimes when those out-of-the-box tools aren't enough, or whatever the logic that you want to implement is becoming really complicated, sometimes it's easier to go with an Apex trigger and write the code yourself, even if that means all the overhead that comes along with it, just because of the power and the control that you're given whenever you use an Apex trigger that you don't get with some of these other tools. So here I purposely have the Apex developer guide up. This is a fantastic resource. Seriously, I'm not underusing the word fantastic there. This is something that I use in my day-to-day as a software engineer. All my peers use it in their day-to-day because it is a really great piece of documentation that has a full range of Salesforce features documented and documented really, really well too. If I were to go and create a PowerPoint to help you guys with your certification exam, honestly, I would just be copying what's in this. And I feel like that's a little bit of a disservice and a little dishonest. So I want to be clear and I want to let everyone know, if you haven't figured it out already, this developer guide is irreplaceable. It is such a good resource. And to truly be able to be a self-sufficient and I personally think a really good Salesforce professional, you need to understand how to leverage these developer guide documentations, whether it's the Apex developer guide or even the Visual Force ones or all the different other ones that are out there. But you didn't come here to listen to me on my soapbox about the developer guide. I will be providing these links as well as the links to the trail mix at the end of this video, but let's go on to actual triggers. So what is a trigger? Trigger is a way for you to invoke Apex code, and it lets you perform custom actions before or after changes. These different actions happen within types of operations like an insert, update, delete, merge, upsert, and undelete. And then we have two different types of triggers, a before trigger and an after trigger. We'll dive into the specifics of what these are. But conceptually, triggers are already something that we're a little bit familiar with some of the previous out-of-the-box tools that we work with. The one that I'm thinking about is the process builder. We create a process builder, give it a name. We associate one process builder to one S object. In this case, that S object is an account. Once we do that, we define when the process should kick off. Whenever the process is created, perhaps, so that's whenever the record's inserted, or whenever it's created or edited. In other words, whenever the record is inserted into the database or updated in the database. If one of these things happen, we have some criteria that we might potentially evaluate. And if it evaluates to true, of course, we call our immediate action and do something with that record or one of the associated records. Otherwise, we evaluate other conditions and do other immediate actions. You can really apply the same thought process to a trigger. The way this works is we write a trigger on a S object. Let's say we write a trigger on account, and before or after, the account gets inserted or updated or deleted or merged and so on, we do some sort of action. We can filter on that action, like how we learned with if conditions, and then we can use lists and maps to be able to update the values within that trigger. So let's dive into it and open up the developer console. So let's say I want to write a trigger on account. What I would do is come down to File, New, Apex Triggers. I will call it the account trigger so everyone knows exactly what it is. And S object, I'll pick account. Okay, so Salesforce gives us some boilerplate code here. gives us the trigger keyword. We'll notice that the extension of the class is actually different than typical Apex classes. This is the name that we just gave it, the keyword on, the S object that we are putting this trigger on, and then the context variables that we saw here in the developer document. Every time you have something listed in here, like before insert, that means before an account is inserted, run whatever piece of code is in here. I'm not limited to just one at a time, so I could do after insert, I could do after update, before update, after delete. If I do all this, that means all the code in here will execute in one of these conditions. So if I didn't have after, say I only had these two, before insert and after insert, if I updated an account, it would never hit these lines of code because I'm not accepting that context within this trigger. Pretty simple. So let's start off with a simple use case of a trigger. So let's say every time the account is updated, the employee field can't be empty. Now you might be thinking that sounds kind of like an overkill for a trigger, and you're absolutely right. To do something this small and standard would probably be best served out of a validation rule, but this brings up two good points. First is we are nowhere near ready to be able to do really complicated things with triggers yet. We just learned what they are literally 2 minutes ago, so not the move. But second, it brings up a really interesting point because this is really what a day-to-day is like as a Salesforce developer or a Salesforce admin. We are given so many options on the Salesforce platform. There's so many different ways to do things. Sometimes we have 3, 4, 5 different ways we could implement a solution. And it's up to us as professionals who know the ins and outs, the pros, the cons, the considerations of all these different features to help come up with the best solution. So yes, if this was a certification exam and they asked you to do the same thing and you said Apex trigger instead of validation rule, you would probably get the question wrong. But just for the purposes of understanding the trigger, this is what we're going to do. Not before insert, not after insert, but what we want is, let's go with before update. And well, first of all, what's passed in? Salesforce lets us access under the trigger class, trigger.new. And this is just literally a list of whatever S object is found on the trigger. So this is just a list of accounts. And that should save, letting me know it's the appropriate conversion. Cool. So that pretty much proves that trigger.new holds a list of accounts. So what you can do now is just like you've been able to do with other lists, you can walk through this list or use a for loop to step through it and be able to do any analysis that you want on it. So let's create a for loop of type count to loop through all our accounts. And remember, we want to throw an error back at the screen if this field is empty during an update. So first, let's get the API name of that field for employee. So we want to say if this account, if the number of employees is equal to null, of course I forgot my if, then we want to throw an error back at the user. How do we do that? Do we need to call a validation rule? Do we need some special syntax? Kinda. So we don't actually need to call a validation rule, but what we can use is this SObject class. Within the SObject class, it's a representation of all the different SObjects, and they have a method in there called addError, where you can put your own error message. And reading the description here marks a trigger record with a custom error message and prevents any DML operations from occurring. That sounds a lot like what we want, right? If that condition is met, we want to throw an error message and we want to prevent the user from saving the record. So let's use that. A.add error. Cool. And then we just need to pass a string like it says there. And that's really the benefit of the docs. I don't need to worry. I don't need to rely on some stranger on Stack Overflow. The answer is right there for us. Cool. So the compiler had no objections. Hopefully you don't either. Let's go ahead and update an account where the number of employees is going to be blank. So handy, I have this one. I'm going to blink it out from 5,000 to blank. Let's see if we get that error message. Cool. Employees should not be empty, just like we were expecting. Now, so you'll notice the context was before update, right? So that means that if I insert an account, okay, so making a new account, I'll just give it another name, and I'll purposely leave employees blank. Let's see if we hit the validation rule. Okay, we did not, as we were expecting, because that trigger was written in a different context. But now, if on that same record, I go to update it, like if I update ticker symbol, I should hit the error. Perfect. Now, if I wanted this to happen in both the before update and before insert context, I could do something like that, which is what if I want this specific code to run in the before update, but I had another condition, like for example, on the account, I didn't want the ticker symbol to be null. What if this is what I wanted? Well, based on the way it's written now, before an update and before an insert, both these things would be happening, which is not what I want. I want to specifically limit it. And the wrong answer is to create multiple triggers on this different context. A better answer would be that we have a if condition, and we can leverage the trigger class again and use the keywords is before and trigger dot is update. And then we can do the same thing here. Grab that. This time we want is insert. Cool. So now we've successfully said, listen, if we're in the before update context, execute this. If we're in the before insert context, execute this. So if I'm in the update context, I'll never have to worry about this piece of code running. And if I'm in the insert context, I'll never have to worry about this piece of code running. Now, trigger.new is not the only variable or list that we have access to. We have a second one called old. So this will be new accounts. This will be old accounts. Now, the distinction between new and old has to do with the order of execution of Salesforce. We talked about this very briefly, but just to highlight it again, whenever a user or another process updates a record or changes some data in Salesforce, it goes through this long laundry list of an execution order that we'll get to in some of the later videos. But what's important for this video is that the record that gets updated, the update happens, but then it soft saves to the database, which means it doesn't actually get persisted yet. But then other things that need to happen after that record is saved still execute. And once everything went according to plan and Salesforce determines there were no errors, it actually commits the data to the database. That's where trigger.new and old come in. Trigger.new is everything that happens in the status and all the fields and what the records look like after the soft save is completely done. And trigger.old is what the record looks like before the soft save is done. So for example, if I were to come in here and I took ticker symbol, which right now is empty, and I updated this to say 123, and of course that can't be blank, and I tried to save this. What would show up in the developer console in my trigger is that it would put the old version of the account, so the version where my ticker symbol was empty, in this list, and it would put the updated version, which is where the ticker symbol is now updated to say 123, in this list. And that gives me some power, because what I can do now is compare what happened when the user updated the record, see what types of values they changed, see what fields they changed, see what the old value was and what the new value was. Now, I realize as I say that, I might be getting too ahead of myself for the context of this video, because what I'm describing is commonly seen in a Apex design pattern called bulk state transition. Now, if you're not familiar with the design pattern, all it is a common and general solution to a very common and general problem. So one common general problem you might have in a trigger is you have code executing in situations where you don't want it to execute. For example, let's say if I didn't want to throw an error if the number of employees is null, I want to throw an error if the number of employees used to have a value and now is null. So that's where you can use trigger.old and trigger.new to your advantage. You'll first, as you're looping through this, you'll look at trigger.old, you'll see if it had a value, and then you'll look at trigger.new and see if it no longer has a value. If that's the case and both those things are true, then you add an error to the screen. If it is currently null and also used to be null, then you don't throw an error. That's just one example of how you would use it, and I'll make another video about that design pattern, as well as some other ones, even though it's not a part of the certification exam. It's what's going to separate you from a really good software engineer and a really good Salesforce developer from someone who's just rushing through the process to get a certification and get a job title. So there are two other context variables that I wanted to talk about. We've discussed trigger.new, trigger.old, and what they are. There's similar versions of these called trigger.oldMap and trigger.newMap. Hopefully you've watched the map video before this one, but it maps the ID of the record to the actual record. The idea behind these is similar. You have all the records that got changed and all their changes that came along with it in this one, and all the records that changed before they actually got changed in this one. The advantage here is that because we have ID, now we can use that using the .get method that we learned about. And then of course, because these are maps, any of the methods that belong to the map class we can utilize here as well. So hopefully you've watched the map video and you're getting some ideas about the different things that you can do. So far, all we've done is throw an error back at the user. It's kind of symbolizing what you can do with the trigger instead of a validation rule. Now let's do one other example where we actually update one of these field values to show how it's similar to a process builder or a workflow rule. So let's go to an account, and let's say every time the account description is empty, I'll populate it with text that says this is a description. And we'll only do that during the update operation. So what we need to do, does the trigger context already match what we want? We have after update and before insert, but we don't have before update, right? Because in this situation, we won't be able to update a field because we're after the soft save, so that record is locked for read only. And the requirement says we want to do it before an update, not before an insert. So that means we're missing one of these variables. So let's add before update. Okay. Now we need to add another condition to make sure we catch the context that we're in. So we want to do is before and trigger dot is update. Now whenever we're in this context, we'll hit any code that's in here, and we won't hit this code, we won't hit this code. And just to switch it up here, instead of using the new account or the old account list, I'll go ahead and use the map just so you see a live demonstration of that as well. Okay, so let's review what I wrote. Before an update, I want you to loop through every account record that's passed with that list and check the description. If the description is equal to null, otherwise known as if the description is empty, I want you to populate the description. And that's all you have to do. Now, whenever I save that record, it'll kick off this trigger, it'll come into this context, and it'll hit that if statement and populate that field. Easy as that. So let's go test this out. So I will update another random field like number of locations. This is currently null. Let's see if it gets updated. Cool, it did. I'm hesitant to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So if you do get confused during the next 1.5 minutes, don't worry. I'll make another video later that goes into what's really going on behind the scenes here. So don't freak out. But let's say I wanted to do what I mentioned earlier, which is that if the description got changed to null and it wasn't null before, then I want to populate it. So what I would need to do is I already have this map here. Now I need to compare the value of this map to the value of the old map. The one thing I'm going to do automatically is instead of looping through the values of the map, I want to loop through the IDs of the map. So I'll update my variable there and loop through the key set. And I'll say if the old version, no, I'll say this. If old map.get ACCID was null, okay, let's see if that compiles. Perfect. So this is a really simple example of the bulk state transition pattern. And again, I don't want to go too in depth, but I want to give you an idea of how triggers can be used in some complicated scenarios and why it was really important to understand maps and lists before we came to this section. So what I'm doing here in this piece of code between lines 19 through 28, before an account gets updated, I want to see if the user changed the description from a populated field to a non-populated field. So if they cleared out the field value and left nothing in its place, I'm going to go ahead in my trigger and populate the description for them. And this is the code that will be able to do it for me. So I can use the .key set to loop through all the IDs of all the account records that are brand new, or I'm sorry, all the account records that got updated. And I want to compare that ID, since there will be a one-to-one relationship in this before update context between old map and new map, meaning every account that's going to be an old map will also be a new map. And that ID is only going to show up once, right? That's what we know about maps. So we can use this .get to compare the values of the description between old map and new map. If that doesn't make sense, please go back and rewatch the map video, and the Salesforce documentation will probably have some content for you about looping through a key set of maps and some of the considerations around them. So what have we learned in this video? We learned what a trigger is, the different context variables, the different types of triggers, old map, new list, old list, and how we can use triggers to either throw errors back at the user, similar to what we see in validation rules, or populate field values, similar to what we see in workflow rules or process builders. Now, there is a lot more ahead of us with triggers. Actually, what I'm doing here is considered bad practice. In a trigger, you should not be having any business logic like I have here inside the trigger. You should delegate that out to another class. And that class is often referred to as the trigger handler. So in the next video, we will go over how to create a trigger handler. I'll be linking some of the Salesforce documentation that I discussed here, as well as the trail mix for this video. Review those, and you'll be all set for our next video going over trigger handlers.